to people that feel invisible, that have felt invisible for almost 20 years, and who feel that the law and the pronouncements and resolutions from this Council are not taken seriously and are not delivered to protect them, to be a shield from them, as the Charter requires.
It's not the first time ICC is conducting investigations in the region. The court has 4 outstanding arrest warrants related to the earlier fighting in Darfur between 2003 and 2008. They include one against former Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir on charges of genocide. The court also opened its first trial on Darfur crimes in April. It involves the case of Janjaweed leader Ali Muhammad Ali Abdi al-Rahman, accused of alleged war crimes committed in 2003 and 2004 in 4 villages in Darfur. Chamgono, CGTN.
The ICC's investigations into a surge of violence in Darfur comes a day after a mass grave was discovered outside El Geneina, the regional capital of West Darfur. The UN Human Rights Office said at least 87 bodies of ethnic Masalit and other people have been found at the site. The deceased were allegedly killed by the Rapid Support Forces and a militia allied to the paramilitary group. The UN office says those buried in the mass grave were killed around the 13th to the 21st of June in El Geneina's districts of Al-Madares and Al-Jamarek. RSF officials have denied any involvement, saying the conflict is tribal. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has condemned the violence. He urged the RSF and other parties to the conflict to allow prompt searches for the dead, as well as their collection and evacuation without discrimination.
RSF's leadership and all parties to the conflict must ensure that the dead are properly handled and their dignity protected. Relief workers must be able to record all available information, including taking proper photos of the bodies and identifying the location of the graves. We call on the RSF leadership to immediately and unequivocally condemn and stop the killing of people and to end violence and hate speech against people on the basis of their ethnicity.
As the fighting in Sudan rages on, reports of abuses against women and girls are increasing. However, there is another phenomenon prevalent in parts of the world experiencing conflict. Researchers have dubbed this phenomenon the silent crisis of male gender-based violence. While statistics indicate that women and girls make up the majority of victims, men and boys are also sexually abused in conflicts. However, the full scale of this crisis globally is unknown because sexual violence against men and boys is such a hidden issue. Well, let's take a deeper look at this. Adding to the silent crisis of sexual violence against men and boys during conflicts, they're also more likely to be killed in such situations. This, according to various studies and reports from journalists on the ground, is because males are often seen as potential soldiers and fighters, and thus a threat to warring sides. Global think tank, the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI, says that targeted killings of men and boys because of their gendered role should be recognized as a form of gender-based violence, similar to sexual violence against women and girls. Sexual violence against men and boys has so far been reported in over 25 conflict-affected countries across the globe. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, where the prevalence of rape in the country's east has been widely reported on for decades, according to ODI, more than 1 in 3 Congolese male refugees have experienced sexual violence. Researchers say that due to stigmatization, the figures of such incidents remains grossly underreported. We're now joined by William Carter, Country Director for Sudan at the Norwegian Refugee Council. He's based in Gedaref, Eastern Sudan. Thank you so much for joining us, William. William, the ICC is investigating Darfur killings and rapes as violence surges in Sudan. What can you tell us, William, about the situation on the ground, especially in the Darfur region?
Thanks, Anna. What's happening in Sudan is devastating. Truly devastating on many levels. We've had airstrikes, rape and pillaging in Khartoum, a new military front is opening in Kordofan, and as you mentioned, the Darfur region, which is expansive. It's the size of Spain or Sichuan province, and it's huge. And at the moment, there's a telecommunications blackout for most of it, but we understand from testimonies and from the glimpses that we've seen from staff and refugees that there's been systematic killings, there's been harsh conflicts, there has been rape, pillaging, wanton destruction. So it's truly devastating. Depressing also that this has been happening for 20 years. There was, as you mentioned, this first round 2 decades ago. We had a peacekeeping mission which folded in Darfur just 2 years ago, and after it's folded, the numbers increased. So as the conflict since April in Khartoum has divided the country, there's been so much lawlessness and misery and suffering in and around Darfur.
William, I want to zone into this report that I read about men and boys also being sexually abused in conflicts, but the full scale of that crisis globally being unknown because it is such a hidden issue. According to your knowledge, William, how prevalent is this issue of violence against men and boys in situations of conflict, especially in Sudan right now, as that is the focus of our reporting?
There's definitely all forms of violence. Some are on an ethnic basis, some are on a gender basis here as well. So, as you say, it's a hugely stigmatized issue. Of course, incredible trauma, not something that survivors often, especially male survivors, often disclose. It's a hugely sensitive topic as well. You know, the warring powers are not just struggling for territorial control, but also legitimacy, and it's often that these types of issues are suppressed. So it's not been easy to get a systematic overview, but in this period of lawlessness, of increased violence, of different attacks, different movements of people, I think it's quite clear that it's highly likely to be happening and very likely to be increasing until there's a stop to this violence.
William, one of the things that was really concerning regarding this, in one report published on the ODI.org website, men are reported to have said, and I have to quote this because I think that this was so profound in just giving a picture of what is happening, and they say that you keep on empowering our women, and this is a quote from them, but who comes to talk to us about regaining our dignity and listening to our problems? With some organizations, William, being aware about how real the crisis is of various abuses against men and boys in situations of conflict, what is some of the work being done to address this issue?
Well, in normal times, there's an emergency response, but there's also longer-term structural and societal issues and legal issues as well that come up for this. Both for women, mostly for women, to be honest, at the moment, as it's slightly more visible than men. I mean, there's work, there's care that needs to be given for survivors and the families, medical, legal, emotional, and humanitarian. That usually needs to cover this, and it's clear that this is a huge need at the moment in Sudan. Right now, there's very limited humanitarian access into Sudan. Many visas have not been issued for NGOs, especially those that specialize in this type of care. Of course, the security situation in some of the worst parts of Darfur will be problematic. So at the moment, there's very little in terms of service provision. There's some monitoring and documentation. There's what local communities are able to offer. But this is a hugely sort of complex and acute need. We need to get specialist responders back in, and NGOs need to get visas for this. So it's, there's work that could be being done, but isn't, to be frank. And yes, there needs to be a pivot. We need to scale up support for women and girls, but also to drive on this less known issue of how men and boys have been affected.
William,
organizations like ours. Thank you.
William, thank you so much for all that. William Carter, Country Director for Sudan at the Norwegian Refugee Council, and he's based in Gedaref, Eastern Sudan. Well, the Summit of Sudan's Neighbors has presented a new initiative to end the conflict in Sudan. The summit, hosted by Egypt, brought together leaders from 7 African countries, along with the chiefs of the African Union and the Arab League. The meeting comes as fighting in Sudan is entering its 4th month. As Yasser Hakim reports, the plan could lead to a ceasefire, the opening of safe passages for humanitarian aid, and dialogue with Sudan's warring parties.
In their keynote speeches, the summit leaders collectively warned of the situation in Sudan and the urgent need to reach a permanent ceasefire to protect the country and its people.
Like any conflict, the consequences are catastrophic on the civilians, and it forces them to be displaced, whether inside or outside Sudan.
Our sisterly nation of Sudan is bleeding. The moment in 2020 we had all celebrated, which signaled a new beginning for a democratic and a stable Sudan, has now vanished.
After a closed session, the African leaders endorsed an Egyptian initiative announced in the final declaration. It includes establishing a committee of the foreign ministers of the 7 neighbors. Their role is to present a practical and effective plan to achieve a permanent ceasefire in Sudan, conduct direct talks with Sudanese sides to outline a roadmap for peace in coordination with the African Union and Arab League, adopt an effective mechanism that will limit the impact of Sudan conflict on its neighbors. The first meeting of this committee will be in Chad. The initiative did not include the deployment of a peacekeeping force in Sudan, a proposal rejected by Sudan's government at the IGAD summit this week. The final statement confirmed the need to maintain the sovereignty and unity of Sudan, and that the neighbors should lead the way to a successful resolution.
The neighbors of Sudan specifically are the most affected by the crisis and the most aware of its complications, which requires that our countries unify our vision and stance towards the crisis and take united decisions to help solve the conflict.
But there were warnings it would be a tough challenge, citing the failed attempts for reconciliation by regional and international powers since fighting broke out in mid-April.
This is a good initiative, but is the beginning of a very long process to transform the Sudanese people from danger to safety. It will need huge efforts, time and capabilities.
Huge efforts indeed, but time is not a luxury anymore. The leaders at the summit have made it clear they seek a quick solution to the Sudan conflict because they have acknowledged that a prolonged crisis would have a damaging political, economic and social impact on the region. This is Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo, Egypt.
Well, Momin Omaki is in Omdurman and joins us now for more on that situation. Thank you so much for joining us, Momin. What has been the reaction in Khartoum, Momin, to Egypt's initiative of launching this ministerial mechanism to communicate with Sudanese warring parties?
Yes, the Sudanese government and also the RSF have welcomed the Egyptian summit. They say that they will cooperate with any initiative, including the Egyptian summit, IGAD summit, and AU summit, AU and international initiative in order to stop the war in Sudan and reach a ceasefire agreement. Both forces, the RSF, the army, the Sudanese government, have welcomed this initiative, and they said that they will cooperate in order to reach a ceasefire agreement, and after that an inclusive political talk that do not exclude anybody.
So, Momin, we're also reporting today that the ICC says that it is investigating the surge of violence in Darfur since the fighting began. What is the situation in Darfur and Khartoum right now?
About the situation, the RSF are still committing crimes, war crimes in Western Darfur and also here in Khartoum. They are continuing to kill people on ethnic basis in Western Darfur. As you know, the United Nations said that more than 1,100 were killed in Western Darfur in Al Geneina alone in the past months. But until now, these crimes are still continuing, according to Masalit Soldred more than 5,000 were killed from this tribe, which is an African tribe. The RSF are very racist in Darfur, and they are still committing these crimes. Speaking about the situation here in Khartoum, they are still also committing looting crimes. Also, the army have committed violations against citizens here in capital Khartoum. However, also about the situation here on the ground, fighting is still continuing here in Khartoum since the early morning, since 5 a.m. And until now in Bahri, in eastern Bahri, the army is conducting combing operations there. And also here in Durman, artillery shelling is still continuing since 5 a.m. The RSF, on the other hand, said that they were able to capture some military vehicles that belong to the army in Bahri.
Momin, thank you so much for bringing us all those updates. Momin Al-Maki speaking to us from Durman in Sudan. Well, the International Organization for Migration is appealing for over $190 million to ramp up its humanitarian response in South Sudan. The East African country continues to face deteriorating humanitarian conditions worsened by endemic violence and climate shocks such as flooding and drought. A civil war has left more than 2.5 million people internally displaced. As David Lemuria reports, the influx of refugees and returnees escaping the conflict in neighboring Sudan is putting even more strain on very limited resources.
South Sudan's border town of Reng has in the past months provided an unlikely haven for returnees and refugees fleeing the conflicts in Sudan. The outbreak of fighting in Sudan on 15 April 2023 resulted in an influx of people fleeing the country to neighboring South Sudan. More than 148,000 individuals, 93% of whom are South Sudanese nationals, have arrived in South Sudan as of 30th June 2023.
When fighting began, we decided to run. We had to run because all that was happening there was fighting. Everything happened so fast. We didn't have time to pack our belongings. I only came with that mat and this child.
IOM South Sudan is among the many humanitarian organizations that have been providing essential services including health, water, sanitation and hygiene. But it says the emergency assistance could only be so much. It has now launched an appeal through which it is seeking $191 million to meet the needs of internally displaced persons, returnees, host community and migrants in South Sudan.
We have ongoing, already existing displacement, which are in need of humanitarian assistance across South Sudan. On top of it, we have drought, we have flooding, and then we have these returnees. So if you combine, it becomes a very complicated humanitarian crisis which needs support.
IOM says it's seeking the funds to adopt a risk-informed approach with a focus on climate resilience and conflict to strengthen communities' resilience to shocks. Humanitarian organizations responding to returnees and refugees following the Sudan crisis say the ever-growing number of people seeking assistance is exerting more pressure to local communities more vulnerable than even the one they're fleeing, and are now calling on the international donor community to step in and help alleviate the crisis. David Lemuria, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
The spokesperson for one of the opposition parties in the Democratic Republic of Congo has been killed. That's according to officials. Video circulating on social media reportedly shows that the former transport minister, who was also a member of parliament, was shot dead. Cherubin Okende was from the party of leading opposition politician Moise Katumbi, who is vying in the presidential election come December. Katumbi says the incident is a political assassination and has called for investigations. His party reports that Okende was first kidnapped from the Constitutional Court in the capital, Kinshasa. His body was later found in his vehicle at a different location. The presidency says that he died in tragic circumstances and is also urging an inquiry into the matter. Okende resigned from the government last year and joined Katumbi, who announced his bid to run against President Felix Tshisekedi. Well, for more on that story, Chris Ochabringa is in Kinshasa and joins us now. Thank you so much for being here with us on Africa Live, Chris. Such an awful story we're hearing. The opposition in the DRC are branding the killing of Cherubin Okende as a political assassination, Chris. What more can you tell us?
That's right. That statement was made by a prominent opposition leader in the DRC known as Moise Katumbi, who is the head of the Ensemble pour la République political party. That's the party where the slain former transport minister Cherubin Okende was a spokesperson. And so Mr. Moise Katumbi is trying to link his death to the political activities that they have been carrying out since May this year. You know, their party has been working very closely with other political parties in the DRC to demand reforms ahead of the elections scheduled for December. One of the issues that they have been calling for is an independent audit of the voters register. They're saying it has very many fictitious names, you know, that were included to rig the election in favor of President Felix Tshisekedi. Well, the government has denied that and also said that the Electoral Commission has also denied it. But Mr. Moise Katumbi is saying that security operatives are trying to create a climate of fear to silence them from keeping, you know, demanding for these reforms before the elections are held. But we're waiting for an official probe from the government, and this death, you know, has brought a lot of sadness in the DRC. The president has condemned it, the Minister of Communication, and a number of diplomats, people from the African Union, the European Union, and the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission have all condemned it and called for a swift probe by the government. Hannah?
Chris, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on that situation. Chris Ochamaringa speaking to us from the DRC's capital, Kinshasa. Well, South Africa's Constitutional Court has rejected an attempt to overturn a previous decision that found former President Jacob Zuma should go back to jail after being released early on medical parole. This means that Zuma could be back in prison 2 years after his initial arrest sparked widespread protests that saw at least 337 people killed in the country. Yulisa Njamela has the details.
81-year-old former President Jacob Zuma was sentenced to 15 months imprisonment in 2021 for defying a court order. The court order was instructing Zuma to give evidence at an inquiry investigating high-level corruption during his 9 years in office, which ended in 2018. The inquiry is known as the State Capture Commission. The former president handed himself over to authorities in July 2021, but 2 months later he was released on medical parole due to ill health. In a statement, the Department of Correctional Services said it was studying the judgment and seeking legal advice before commenting. The Constitutional Court ruling could send Zuma back to prison 2 years after his initial arrest sparked widespread protests that saw over 300 people killed. A spokesperson for Zuma declined to comment on the ruling. Yulisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has wrapped up a three-nation Africa tour in Zimbabwe. Raisi visited Kenya and Uganda earlier this week. CGTN's Farai Mokatuya brings us more from Harare.
Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi touched down at the Robert Mugabe International Airport in Harare on Thursday morning, where he was received with full military honors. He later held talks with his Zimbabwean counterpart, Emmerson Mnangagwa, after which the two leaders presided over the signing of multiple agreements in agriculture, telecommunications, higher education, petroleum, oil and gas. Zimbabwe and Iran have a joint permanent commission on cooperation which has exchanged reciprocal visits over the last 12 months. They have laid the groundwork for the 12 MOUs that were signed at State House on Thursday. The two nations agreed to remain resolute in the face of international isolation.
It is critically important that the victims of Western sanctions, are talking to each other. The authors of these sanctions would not want us to talk to each other, but because we are both victims, it is critically important that we show them that we are united. And I'm happy that we share this view.
Raisi castigated the West for manipulating emerging information communication technology to do harm instead of advancing humanity, and said the technological cooperation with Zimbabwe would be of mutual benefit.
I hope that our cooperation our bilateral cooperation with the Republic of Zimbabwe, and our cooperation with African continent, which is the continent of capacities and potentials, could help us for advances of both countries, both nations.
Raisi's visit to Africa is the first to the continent by an Iranian leader since 2013. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, let's take a look at what's coming up in the day's business news. Families of 20 Gambian children who died after consuming deadly cough syrups made in India to sue their government this month. And the International Monetary Fund approves $189 million for Zambia after debt breakthrough.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Well, families of 20 Gambian children who died after consuming cough syrups made in India are set to take their government to court this month for allegedly mishandling drug imports. The parents' allegations and testimony are detailed in court documents shared with Reuters. The documents paint a picture of panic, desperation, and heartbreak. One mother, for instance, unwittingly continued to give her child toxic medicine for 2 days after he started vomiting, while another family was forced to repair a leaking intravenous drip that the hospital had attached to their child. At least 70 children died from acute kidney injury in Gambia last year. The World Health Organization linked the deaths to medicines made by Indian drug maker Maiden Pharmaceuticals. The affected families are seeking about $250,000 in compensation for each child. Well, moving on to Zambia now, where the International Monetary Fund will extend a loan of $189 million after completing the first review of a 38-month extended credit facility. This brings Zambia's total disbursements from the IMF to about $374 million. Lusaka's extended credit facility arrangement is for a total of $1.3 billion. The latest disbursement comes as Zambia this week engages international bondholders to restructure debt and ease pressure on the country's economy. It announced last month a breakthrough deal with its official creditors to rework $6.3 billion in loans. The copper-producing nation became Africa's first pandemic-era sovereign defaulter back in 2020 and has since been trying to restructure its debt. Well, elsewhere, Mozambique's former finance minister Manuel Chang pleaded not guilty in a U.S. federal court on Thursday in New York. It's in connection with a $2 billion corruption and money laundering scandal that prosecutors said defrauded American investors and threatened to further destabilize Mozambique's economy. The U.S. charges relate to loans obtained from Credit Suisse and Russia's VTB Bank that were guaranteed by the Mozambican government and signed off by Chang during his 2005-2015 term as finance minister. The money was looted through kickbacks and other corrupt dealings. That's according to U.S. prosecutors. Until his extradition to the United States on Wednesday, Chang had been held in South Africa after being arrested in Johannesburg in 2018 on a U.S. warrant. The East African community is seeking to expand to at least 10 member countries. Secretary General Peter Matuki says that talks are advanced to have Somalia joined in the bloc soon. The East African community currently consists of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Southern Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Kenya's President William Ruto also invited Comoros to join the bloc when he toured the country last week. CGTN's Najma Abdurazik has more details.
Coordinating the implementation of the continent's integration agenda is set to be a key topic of discussions over the next few days in the Kenyan capital, as the African Union, heads of state and government, along with regional communities, gather for the 5th edition of the Mid-Year Coordination Meeting.
Today I talked about the integration of Africa. We were talking about why is it that we want to trade. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, yet movement from one African country to another country is difficult.
The meeting comes as host nation Kenya, along with its other East African Community member countries, look towards implementing their own regional framework.
It is attracting countries to join East Africa is a framework. Looking at the 4 pillars of regional integration, that is, the first one is the customs union, meaning movement of goods within these countries freely. And the second pillar is the common market protocol, which now allows movement of people freely, but also goods within the community. And the third pillar is now the monetary union, having the single currency, and then ultimate political federation.
The bloc mostly has its eye on attracting more member states. With the admission of the Democratic Republic of Congo last year and Somalia now the latest country on the wait list, EAC authorities say an expansion is the next big move that will provide the regional bloc with new markets that will boost trade and business.
With how the evolving global issues, economic and political, we are saying as East Africa, we want to have a minimum of 10 partner states becoming part of East Africa. And that is now with admission of Somalia, that those will be 8 countries. So we'll be looking now at Ethiopia, Djibouti, Eritrea, even Sudan. So that we have a strong, formidable bloc that would now provide for almost 700 to 800 million people. And that is a huge market.
Although EAC economies are expected to register positive growth this year, the region is still grappling with a huge trade deficit, with its import bill far surpassing those of export revenues. The region's total exports to the rest of the world amounted to $20.1 billion in 2022, against imports exceeding $53.8 billion. But on the upside, intra-East African Community trade saw a growth of 11.2%, reaching the $10 billion mark in 2022 from $9.8 billion in 2021. Najma Abdirizak, CGTN.
South Sudan's government has commissioned a 4-megawatt power plant in the country's northwestern town of Wau. It's a move aimed at expanding energy access across the country. The power plant is currently being tested, and the government says it plans to complete connection to the town within the next 2 months. CGTN's Patrick Oyet reports.
About 620 kilometers northwest of Juba, the town of Wau has got electricity for the first time since 2012.
We are moving in a very good way in terms of development, including in this state. In addition to the electricity, we are building a road between the capital and here in Bar El Ghazal.
A power plant fired by diesel generators was built with funds donated by Egypt, but when war broke out in the country in 2013, it could not be maintained. Trinity Energy Limited, a South Sudanese company, is operating the power plant on behalf of the local government. It will provide electricity to the town's 130,000 residents.
The World Bank says only 8% of the South Sudan's 13 million population have access to electricity, and that the cost of a unit of electricity in the country is among the highest in Africa.
Experts say a hydropower plant is the best option for South Sudan in terms of ease of continued operation and maintenance. Trinity Energy says it plans to expand the power plant using a solar system, and that it is targeting all residents of the area with electricity.
We are going to work with the team and our people in Western Bar Ghazal to ensure that all the citizens get power with the reasonable or feasible cost that will not, push our people away from the power that we are going to give away.
South Sudan's government says it plans to take similar projects to major towns across the country. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Wow, South Sudan.
In sports news, we start with tennis, where Tunisian Ons Jabeur has made it to a second successive Wimbledon final after defeating Aryna Sabalenka 6-7, 6-4, 6-3. Jabeur, who was beaten in last year's final, looked destined to suffer more heartbreak on center court when she lost the opening set. However, she raised two chances Sabalenka had for 5-3 before breaking her serve for the first time all match to get herself back in the contest. The 28-year-old claimed the third set, making her the first woman to reach back-to-back finals at Wimbledon since Serena Williams in 2018 and 2019. The victory set up the final between the Tunisian 6th seed and unseeded Czech Markéta Vondrousova. Jabeur is 3-3 against Vondrousova all-time, including a win in their only grass court meeting.
I'm learning to transform the bad energy into a good one. So the anger that I had from this first set, I try to stay focused. You know, some things I have no control over. You know, she can ace anytime, she can hit a big serve even if I have a break point, and that's frustrating a bit. But I'm glad that I'm accepting it and digging deep. You know, to just go deep, to go and win this match and hopefully this tournament.
Well, the FIFA World Cup may be over 2 years away, but the draw for the CAF preliminary qualifiers was held in the Ivorian capital Abidjan on Thursday, with the continent's teams finding out who they will meet on the road to the tournament set for the United States, Mexico and Canada. FIFA President Gianni Infantino wished all African nations success in the World Cup qualifiers as the tournament expands to welcome 48 teams instead of 32. The draw was kind to 2022 semi-finalists Morocco, who were drawn with Zambia, Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Niger and Eritrea. The top team in each of the 9 groups, which each contains 6 countries, will gain qualification. The 4 best runners-up will enter a playoff stage, where the winners will feature in the Inter-Confederation playoffs to be held in March 2026. African teams begin their qualifier campaigns in November of this year.
We will have all African countries participating in what will be an incredibly exciting and passionate qualification path to the World Cup 2026. We are looking forward to this draw, to the games and all the emotions that we'll feel in this incredible continent. So here from Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, beautiful city, beautiful country, to the whole of Africa and to the entire world. Welcome. This is the trophy that want to win. Maybe in 26. Well, that's all I wish to all of you, but I wish the same to every other country in the world as well.
Well, hundreds of people turned up despite the winter cold to queue along Wellington Harbour on Friday to catch a glimpse and take a photo with the Women's World Cup trophy as the tournament draws closer. Retired U.S. women's team legend Carly Lloyd also attended the morning event, and she believes the American squad has the talent to win this year's event, while also conceding it would be the hardest World Cup to win. Lloyd believes that the World Cup Down Under will be the biggest, the best, the most competitive, and will inspire young girls around the world to get involved in the sport. The trophy is on the final leg of its tour before the tournament begins on July the 20th.
I think it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really challenging. There's, there's still some question marks within the U.S. squad. They do have some injuries. They've got some key players that are out due to injury. So I think it's going to be really tough. But they definitely, have the talent, the depth, and all of that to be able to go for a three-peat.
Well, that's it for this edition of Africa Live. Remember that you can send your feedback to the contacts on the screen and follow us on our digital media platforms. For me, Hannah Vivier, and the rest of the Africa Live team, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again next time.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from CGTN Beijing, this is Asia Today.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nicho in Beijing. It's 7 p.m. here in the Chinese capital. Coming up on Asia Today.
Indonesian President Joko Widodo has called for partner countries of ASEAN to seek win-win solutions instead of a zero-sum approach. Germany unveils its China strategy, citing a need to reduce economic dependency while highlighting its desire to work together on global challenges.
We hope that Germany can view China's development objectively and comprehensively and formulate a rational and pragmatic policy towards China.
Plus, torrential rains in South Korea have left about 4,000 households temporarily without electricity.
Heavy rainfall is forecast not just for the weekend, but the entire week ahead.
Our top story, Indonesian President Joko Widodo has called for partner countries of ASEAN, the Southeast Asian nations bloc, to seek win-win solutions instead of a zero-sum approach. President Widodo was addressing the ASEAN Regional Forum in Jakarta. He said ASEAN must not become an arena for competition. Indonesia chairs the bloc this year and hosted the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting for 2023, which concludes today. During the past 4 days, foreign ministers of the bloc and partner countries, including China, Russia, and the United States, have met for bilateral and multilateral talks. And our correspondent Roberlin Purba is joining us live from Jakarta with more updates. Good to see you, Roberlin. We understand diplomats have met for the final day of meetings. What are the key takeaways from today's engagements?
Yes, now ministers have had dialogues on the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, further pushing for the trade agreement to happen. And still on trade, China and ASEAN have also are pushing ahead with talks on a third version of their free trade agreement. Now, Norway, Indonesia, and ASEAN also have had meets where they previously met to talk about renewable energy, cooperation, climate change, ocean sustainability, and blue economy. Now, the U.S. ASEAN meets also happened, and the U.S. Foreign Secretary Blinken says that they upgraded the U.S.-ASEAN relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership last year and are working hard to put the enhanced relationship into concrete action together. Now, he mentioned internet connectivity and technologies, as well as as small businesses need to compete in the 21st century. Now, there were mentions pointing to the ongoing Myanmar crisis as well, and overall, I would say that the main theme in these discussions are as they are trying to solve conflicts going on in the region. And as you've mentioned before as well in the previous story, as Indonesian President Widodo wants ASEAN to not become an arena for competition. And it seems that stability and peace in the region is the key focus, I would say, which is key to have economic growth for the region.
And Chinese senior diplomat Wang Yi has met with Foreign Minister of Japan in Jakarta. What's been discussed?
Right, so this issue, as they met on the sidelines of these meetings, in the discussions for the planned Fukushima nuclear waste released into the sea by Japan. Now, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported previously that the waste will have minor impact on the people and environment, right? And Japan plans to release the waste according to international standards. But China urged Japan to stop the plan, right? Saying that the agency's safety is not green lit to discharge the nuclear waste, as it contains traces of tritium. Now, there are already hints on China reassessing their food imports from Japan because of this, and Japan actually disagrees with China's claim and assures that the waste is safe after it was treated. Now, China is urging Indonesia, as the chair of ASEAN this year, to also oppose the plan as well.
Thank you very much for bringing us the latest. Robert Limperba joining us live from Jakarta. Thailand's election-winning Move Forward Party has announced plans to limit powers of the military-appointed Senate by amending an article of the Constitution. Well, the move comes a day after the House thwarted party leader Pita Limjaroenrat's bid to become prime minister. The system to have the 249-member Senate and elected lower house decide a prime minister was designed after a coup in 2014. It's seen as a constitutional safeguard to protect the interests of the military and conservatives. Thailand's parliament will hold another prime minister vote on July 19th. And as criticisms mount over Washington's decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine, Laos, a landlocked nation in Southeast Asia, still grapples with deadly war remnants 5 decades after the last bombs were dropped by U.S. forces during the Vietnam War. Most cluster munitions were used in Laos than any other country in the world, which has killed tens of thousands of civilians. Our correspondent Dusita Salkau reports from Laos.
Sometimes it starts with a nightmare to realize peace. Sometimes that nightmare just never ends. Sometimes the most peaceful places hide the most tragic scars, because it's what you cannot see that has shattered the lives of people in this remote village. A decade ago, it was just a normal day. Young boys doing what they usually do, playing, throwing around a small round object they found in the forest. Intrigued, they tried to cut it open with a knife. A few strikes, then an earth-shaking explosion. A sound that haunts still, even to this day.
I picked up my grandson's wounded body. He died from the explosion. I always think about this incident when I work, eat. I always think about it.
The older generation here lived through the war. They believed it ended. But this incident that left 3 dead reminds them that they are just merely surviving peace. A sentiment felt throughout this entire country. Between 1964 and 1973, the Americans flew more than 500,000 missions over Laos, dropping more than 2.5 million tons of bombs. That's one bomb every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 straight years.
Lao PDR was subjected to a very heavy bombing campaign. And over those years, it is estimated that more than 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on the country. We know that still to this day, all 18 provinces of Lao PDR are contaminated.
It was a conflict that became known as the Secret War.
Everywhere, every place, houses were destroyed, our land was destroyed, livestock killed. We don't consider this as a secret war. We all see the consequences.
Say Samon has been doing this for 28 years. It's a painstaking task, using detectors to manually map every centimeter of the ground. On a normal day, her team finds around 10 to 20 cluster munitions. On a good day, more than 100. And considering only 1% of contaminated land has been cleared, she tells me that it is impossible to clear Laos of all the bombs dropped. But each bomb destroyed is potentially lives saved. So that explosion was from a bomb that we found in the grounds today. Now we are at a relatively safe distance, around 200 to 300 meters away. But to think that a child or a group of children could be playing or kicking these things around is just devastating. Children account for 40% of victims. The allure is fatal, a curse that lasts a lifetime. They say the body keeps a record of trauma and pain. But few would understand what this would feel like. Not knowing your children's faces, to live every day without sight, without a limb, with little hope.
The misery is intolerable. Blindness is like death. My daughters need to be my eyes. It's torture. Nothing can ever compare to this.
What becomes of war after war ends? After the last shots fired? After the last bombs dropped? What becomes of the people that try so hard to move on, because for them, war never really ends. It silently lingers in rice fields, playgrounds, villages, ready to claim more innocent victims. Dusita Salkau, CGTN, Laos.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be given one of France's most spectacular recognitions as guest of honor at the Bastille Day military parade. On Friday, Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron will watch French and Indian soldiers march down the Champs-Élysées Avenue in Paris. The French-made Rafale fighter jets India purchased in 2015 will also take part in the flypast over the Arc de Triomphe. The parade comes after New Delhi gave initial approval to purchase an extra 26 Rafale jets and 3 Scorpion-class submarines as the two nations seek a stronger alliance in the Indo-Pacific. Modi began a 2-day visit to Paris on Thursday, less than a month after U.S. President Joe Biden hosted him for a state visit. Time now for world headlines. Uganda's President Yoweri has accused former leader of DR Congo, Joseph Kaliba, of sheltering Islamist fighters and allowing them to exploit and sell minerals and timber to build their strength. Last month, the former Uganda-based rebel group sneaked across the borders into Uganda and attacked a school, killing 42 people, mostly students. Some were burned alive. Hollywood actors will join an ongoing strike by screenwriters in New York and Los Angeles. This comes after talks with studios and streaming services hit a wall as actors and writers demand base pay increases and assurances that their work will not be replaced by artificial intelligence. Studios now face their first dual work stoppage in 63 years. Most production for TV and movies have been forced to a halt. Southern Europe is facing extreme heat, with a warning that temperatures could hit record highs for the continent next week. The European Space Agency forecasts possibly the hottest July ever in Europe, with temperatures to climb to 48 degrees Celsius on the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. Greece is bracing for temperatures as high as 44 degrees Celsius by Saturday. You're now watching Asia Today. Still ahead on the program. Beijing warns against counterproductivity after Germany unveils its China strategy, which points to systemic rivalry and a need to reduce the risk of economic dependency in relations. Also ahead, torrential rain in South Korea cuts power to 4,000 households and forces residents to evacuate their homes. Stay with us on Asia Today. Germany has issued a strategy paper for relations with China. It points to a systemic rivalry with China and a need to reduce risks of economic dependency, but highlights Berlin's desire to work with Beijing on global challenges such as climate change. And in response, the Chinese embassy in Germany said that viewing China as a competitor and systemic rival does not accord with reality, nor does it benefit either side's interests. Trent Murray has the latest from Berlin.
This is a strategy we've been waiting now for several months. It was finally unveiled today, all 40 pages of it. This is very much Berlin's new blueprint, in its view, for its relationship with its top trading partner, China. Now, we know, of course, that this report focused heavily on economic ties, given those trade links. On the question of economic ties, the strategy says that economic and trade relations remain an important element of bilateral cooperation with China. But on that question of systemic rivalry, the report says that this systemic rivalry is reflected in the fact that Germany and China have different concepts of the principles governing the international order in important areas. Now, we know, of course, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, when this report was launched, again spoke heavily about those economic ties, but he said that, frankly speaking, in his view, Germany needs to be careful that it's just not too dependent on any one trading partner. He said in a tweet the goal is not to decouple from China, but we want to avoid critical dependencies in the future. Now, there were areas in there as well where Berlin said there were disagreements in certain policy areas. Very much this report trying to strike that balance between maintaining those strong economic ties, but also understanding that there are areas of disagreement. Some of those, according to this strategy, include disinformation, intellectual property rights, peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and the application of universal human rights. Roughly an hour after the strategy was released, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock gave a keynote speech on Germany's relations with China. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
We can't ignore the huge Chinese market, and we don't want to. But at the same time, it is equally true that the Chinese market also needs the European one. Therefore, we cannot be indifferent to the tensions around Taiwan. A military escalation would also be a danger for millions of people worldwide, and therefore also in our country.
Well, not long after it was released, we got a statement from China's embassy here in Germany. I will read that to you in full. The embassy says that forcibly de-risking based on ideological prejudice and competition anxiety will only be counterproductive and artificially intensify risks. The embassy goes on to say that it hopes Germany views China's development rationally, comprehensively and objectively, and that many of the challenges facing Germany have not been caused by China. Now, one thing I will say is that there is very much an overarching theme in that strategy, that even in there are areas that are agreement or areas where there are disagreements, that what is really fundamental is dialogue and communication, and making sure that those channels of communication remain firmly open between Berlin and Beijing, of course, to avoid any sort of misunderstandings or miscalculations on some of these key geopolitical issues.
And as Trump mentioned, Beijing says Germany's forceful de-risking based on ideological prejudice and competition anxiety will be counterproductive. China hopes Germany can view its development objectively and comprehensively and formulate a rational and pragmatic policy.
Taking competition and protectionism policy in the name of de-risking or reducing dependence, and pan-securitization and pan-politicization of normal cooperation will only be counterproductive and artificially intensifies risks. In fact, China and Germany have far more consensus than differences and far more cooperation than competition. Both sides should be viewed as partners rather than rivals. Amid the current complex and volatile international environment, we hope that Germany can view China's development objectively and comprehensively and formulate a rational and pragmatic policy towards China.
For more analysis, let me bring in Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Great to have you with us, Mr. Cui. Now, in that paper, Germany called China a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. How are you looking at this?
As we know, this so-called multi-faced definition about China certainly is one of the starting point for this German strategy. As we know, even earlier from the European Union, it's tried to give the same, definition about China. But now, as we know, this kind of a definition about China makes some more trouble for this bilateral relations between China and Germany, and also between China and Europe. As we know, so far, China is not accepting this kind of definition officially, because as we know, in the reality, always China tried to insist this definition of the relations between China and Europe, between China and Germany as a partner, especially the strategic partner. Once German government insists this kind of definition about China, I think it will give some more troubles in the practice. As we know, once the both sides have some economic cooperation, once there are some competition, so how could German side to decide the nature of the cooperation, or how to deal with any kind of issues from this cooperation? So I think it gives a lot of trouble, not only now, and also once the German government will insist this kind of definition. So I think it will give some more challenges to these relations.
And China has been Germany's most important trading partner for 7 years in a row. How will this China strategy affect trade relations?
Certainly, I think the trade relations between China and Germany is the focus of this document. As we know now, China and Germany, they do have a very big volume of bilateral trade, and also they do have a very, very deep interdependence relations in trade and investment. But as we know now, the German government launched the issue of de-risking or reduce dependency on China and so on. So I think it will give some negative impact on this trade between China and Germany. So I think now from China and Germany, from especially starting from a common interest of both two countries, they need to have a deep discussion about what's the risk for both two sides. Especially, I think from China's perspective, China is not a risk for not only in the German economy and also for German so-called national security. So I think both two sides need to have some more discussion and to find some details to push forward its cooperation, even in the environment of so-called, German side take care more about so-called economic security.
Yeah, and Germany is Europe's biggest economy and the European Union's most populous member. How do you think Berlin's strategy will impact other European nations?
As we understand that because Germany is the biggest trading partner with China in Europe, so for some time, German side take a lot of the pressures from some other member states of the European Union, especially from the United States. So it's understandable that German side try to renew its strategy towards China, but also at the same time, I think Germany should take some more account about its common interests with China. So now I think that for some other European countries, they will have a look at this strategy, and maybe they also have some similar policy judgment. But of course, I think at the same time, most of European countries, they do have their own understanding about their relations with China in trade and some other areas. So they do have their own understanding and their own consideration about the relations with China. So I don't think there will be some more, large influence from this strategy on some other more European countries.
All right, Mr. Cui Hongjian, live for us. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. Appreciate it. Torrential rain in South Korea has left about 4,000 households temporarily without electricity in Seoul and forced more than 130 people across the nation to evacuate their homes. At the start of the weekend, most parts of the country remain under heavy rain alert, with the wider Seoul area forecast to see downpours of up to 50 millimeters per hour. Jack Barton has the latest from Seoul.
South Korea's highest level of weather alert remains in effect across much of the country, which is why boom gates like the one you can see behind me are down, blocking access to any flash flood prone waterway, carrying away the waters from the torrential downpours this country has experienced over the last week, some of the heaviest since 2020, which was the wettest summer since records began. South Korea's Prime Minister has instructed the government to make all-out efforts to prevent further damage from heavy rains, emphasizing that preventing casualties should be the top priority. The Prime Minister also urged other agencies, including the police and firefighting authorities, to activate an all-out response system to promptly restore any emergency situations such as power outages and damaged roads. The order was given after many people across the country were evacuated from their homes and thousands of Seoul residents were left without electricity. Extensive flooding in Seoul's fashionable Gangnam district has also led to traffic chaos. And there's no sign of a let-up. Heavy rainfall is forecast not just for the weekend, but the entire week ahead, with areas to the east and south of the capital expected to be particularly hard hit, with rainfall of up to 200 millimeters per day. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
Climate change is accelerating the rise in the sea levels around the world, and experts have warned sea levels could rise by 25 to 30 centimeters by 2050. Now, this has left some of the most vulnerable populations at risk, particularly those in island nations. Owen Poland and Gretchen Malala report.
Based on current trajectories, sea levels are expected to rise by about half a metre over the next 40 years. And that's going to have an impact on roughly 65% of the population who live within 5 kilometres of New Zealand's coastline. Now, New Zealand's climate change minister says that savage storms and flooding over recent years show that climate change is already here. And he says that planning for future sea level rises has to start now. As a result, the government has prepared a national adaptation plan, which sets out a variety of options to manage the risk. These include building seawalls and also restrictions on future developments near the coast. It's been estimated that the risk to New Zealand from the sea level rise to private and public property could be around $100 billion US. And the big question is, who's going to pay if people are forced to leave their homes? It's an issue that community leaders say is going to lead to some very difficult conversations in the years ahead.
The whole country, not just Manila, is really suffering from the effects of the rising sea level. And that's because half of the country's cities and communities are located along its coast. And there are now many towns and coastal villages that are permanently submerged in water. There are villages in the province of Bulacan, for example, where streets are flooded even if there's no rain. Scientists from the Philippine Weather Bureau has released a report that the sea level rise of the Philippines is rising 3 times faster compared to the global average. And the past 2 decades alone, the Philippine Sea has risen 12 centimeters or about 5 inches. With the climate change, the government has laid down a national climate change action plan, and it has increased its budget for adaptation and mitigation programs. But the government can't do it alone, and it needs help from the private sectors and the international community as well.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Asia Today. I'm Li Chuan in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Coming up next is Dialogue. Stay tuned.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The U.S. Supreme Court affirmative action ruling in college admissions has raised questions on the effects of diversity in both universities as well as in workplaces, legacy admissions, poverty, and so on. So how will the ruling affect future college admissions in the U.S.? Will minorities now have less opportunities in education and employment? And what's the road to true equality? To help us answer these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined by Professor Ray Baker of Towson University, Adolfo Franco, attorney and Republican strategist, and Gary Moore, core team of High Street. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. We know the U.S. Supreme Court, the ruling against using race as a factor in admissions. First of all, I want you to share with us your stance on this ruling, so we know where you are. We can continue our discussion right after that. We'll start with Professor Ray Baker.
Yeah, the ruling was difficult for many in the United States from my perspective, and the reason it was difficult is because race is very much a factor, a part of our lived society. Our society functions and was written. A lot of our constitutional laws, although they do not explicitly mention race by name, although they do not identify black people, a lot of our laws are fundamentally written around anti-blackness. Some of the most pivotal United States laws coming in for our constitutional period, and even through the 1900s, when many in the United States thought that we were making our great ascension to become a global empire, many of those laws were written around race. And so for now, our Supreme Court, to try to understand or interpret legislation and public policy as though we should not acknowledge or consider race, feels a bit dishonest if we are ever looking to make whole the United States, if we are ever looking to be just in the United States. If we're not interested in justice, this ruling is fine. But if we are, unfortunately, this ruling sets us back quite a bit.
Okay, so it's a setback. So Adolfo, what's your understanding here?
Well, I couldn't disagree more with the other guest. In the first instance, there's something called the Equal Protection Clause of the United States, which means everyone should be treated equally and in the same fashion. And of course, anytime you are taking into account quotas and other factors in a rather subjective way, you're discriminating against one group. I think Chief Justice Roberts got it absolutely right. The way to end racial discrimination is to not discriminate on the basis of race. The problem with the other guest, he's absolutely right about the history of this country and the history of every society that continues to evolve. He would make a good case 100 years ago or plus, but that's just not the America of today in the first instance. And then secondly, it just say the approach that was being done should primarily be on merit, and other factors need to be taken into consideration. The fact of the matter is that if you eliminated the race here, boxes that people were checked, and you did this blindly, 95%, according to the case here, if you read it carefully, 95% of the Asian students who applied would have been selected. So you need to get the pool of candidates that have merit first, and then consider, among other factors, the personal experiences and if there was racial discrimination of the individual applicants. But this is just a fancy way of saying, I want quotas, and it's absolutely wrong.
Gary, so where do you stand?
I feel very, very torn on this subject, right? Because having been during the period of affirmative action, somebody that applied for college, and to be very honest, somebody that would think about this topic as an Asian American, like, would this help me selfishly, right? But at the same time, I think my stance on it is really a function of, it really depends on where the dialogue continues to go on after this ruling. Because the idea that you should use race, to me, purely like based on the color of your skin, should that impact or make a decision factor? I think that's an oversimplification. I think the lived experience or like the first guest was saying, right? Like the history and the biases that kind of disadvantage the population, that's what's trying to be compensated for. If it's purely a color issue, I think that's really, that's the way outdated thought. It doesn't really work today. And I think the notion, number one, is how can we include more of this, as Biden says, diverse thought into the class pool? And number two is, fundamentally, college is a scarce resource. So how do you divide it up, right? So if it's going more towards one race, of course, like if it's not towards Asians, we're going to protest, right? If it's more towards Asians, other people are going to protest. So from my stance, it's like, where can we continue to evolve this notion of bringing in the formerly disadvantaged groups instead of just letting the public be like, okay, it's all about color, because that's completely nonsensical in a way, to keep the dialogue on that basis.
Okay, justice, fairness, and equality. So Ray, here, I think, Adolfo raised the question, if we talk about, of course, we need to keep in mind this long history of racism in this country. And that's a reality. I would say there still are, racist incidents there. But then again, I think Adolfo has a point. How long will such practice, of selecting students, with race as a factor, or preferential treatment for colored students, how long it will continue, and where is the end?
Well, the question needs to be raised as what counts as preferential treatment, right? Does legacy admission count as preferential treatment? Does a scholarship, as if you're an exceptional athlete, count as preferential treatment? Does merely being related to someone who donated large sums of money to a university count as preferential treatment? Because the way that this Supreme Court case was brought and the way